necessarily talking about the sermon, but a brief series here on Holy Week.
Correct.
And so each day this week in the podcast feed or on YouTube, wherever you're getting this, you're going to find a really brief video, audio, where we describe the different events that are happening corresponding to that Holy Week some 2,000 years ago. And so before we get into Sunday, which is the first day, we'll be talking about, let's talk a little bit about why this is a really helpful practice to do really each and every year, is remember the events of Holy Week. What are we expecting or hoping to get out of this act of remembrance?
For me, I year by year, I think I would do this now. It's become a little bit of a practice almost, I guess you could say, but not in the way technical sense we've been using the term practices. But over the past number of years, to just really familiarize myself with the story. This is the most important person, the most important story in all the world, and I just want to be really, really familiar with the main parts of it.
Right.
And so I think that's. So doing the podcast is just kind of like an extra bonus. It motivates me to go back and look at things and review it. And then, it's really the center. This is the center of what's going on at the Bible, really. And really, as Christians, we would understand to be the center of history.
Yeah, everyone always is like, the last words they ever spoke were this or that or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so, obviously, the last week of Jesus' earthly life, before he, obviously raises again, comes back and talking to his disciples, but leading up to that, pinnacle moment of his life, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
This is the climax of his story, so to speak, on earth at least. And so it's very significant.
And the fact that, it should, as Christians, sometimes we take it for granted, the historical plausibility / reliability that we enjoy in our faith, which not, other major world religions don't have, respectfully, they don't nearly have the kind of historical reliability that we have. We can know that this happened within a week.
Right.
It's really, it's very personalizing. It helps me enter in. It's oh no, Jesus was doing this on Sunday. Oh, he was doing this on Monday,
right.
Tuesday, Wednesday. Now there's going to be quote unquote discrepancies in here as you work through that. The synoptic writers and John, they have, sometimes a little bit different timetables and things like that. But in general, we can kind of know what happened on which days of the week leading up to Jesus' final day. Even there, John has it Thursday, the synoptics have it Friday. But, some of that's just depending on which calendar you're using and how you're using the term day and things like that. So there's no major discrepancies in there, but, it's pretty crazy that we can see, well, man, we sometimes say, boy, had a week.
Mm-hmm.
It's we can look at Jesus' final week, and as you said, Jay, it's really important. These final things, climax, things are being fulfilled in dynamic, powerful ways. And so to become really familiar with the events themselves, and then, of course, we want those events and spiritual realities to then come into our lives and become part of us.
It also helps you just put yourself in the story, and these are all these famous stories that we hear: cleansing the temple, the last meal with his disciples. All these random, not random, but all these stories are together in one week,
right.
And so they're all culminating on each other and building upon each other. So Jesus' emotions that he was experiencing on Sunday are really similar to the ones he's experiencing on Friday or whatever, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so they're connected in that way rather than just separate stories.
Yeah.
It's pretty helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you may not realize, you may think of Holy Week in terms of Palm Sunday,
right?
Good Friday,
and Resurrection.
Yeah.
But to think of, the high priestly prayer, Jesus cursing the fig tree, flipping over the money chain,
right.
so there's a lot of stuff that's going on this week. And so, as we would see, the sacrifice of Jesus as this high point of his earthly ministry, and then by extension, all of the scriptures, it's really helpful to unpack the whole week. And so, we're looking forward to that. Yeah.
So I'd encourage you before we, maybe jump into the discussion of the first day there with Monday is just, set aside some time, to be reading. There's a great resource that we've used pretty consistently. It's called The Final Days of Jesus. And so we can make that link available for you. You can get it on Amazon and get it in Kindle. There's some accompanying videos that go along with it, which are really helpful. They're like maybe 4 to 5 minute videos per day. And we can make those links available to you guys as well. And just encourage you to set aside some time with some family or some friends or brothers and sisters in Christ and spend 15, 20, 30 minutes each day. You can read through the passages of Scripture. You can watch the videos. If you want to engage with the book, you can certainly engage with the book. And I think it's been very enriching. Again, it's what we plan on doing in the Osborne household. And so encourage you guys to do the same thing, just logistically and practically there.
Mm-hmm. And people can even search, search like Harmony of the Holy Event, weeks of Holy, the events of Holy Week, and you can find even some charts where it's like, here's the events as recorded in Matthew and Mark and Luke and John for each day as well. So, you can do that with the scriptures as well. So, so let's get into Sunday. Sunday, certainly known as Palm Sunday, triumphant entry.
Tragic entry, I've heard.
Tragic entry. So what's going on with this day? Let's kind of walk through the events and then talk through some significance.
Yeah, there's basically, again, as the authors of the Final Days of Jesus kind of label it here, there's 3 events that are happening on this Sunday. The big one, of course, being that Jesus enters Jerusalem. So we'll talk about that. The second one being that Jesus predicts his death, which is primarily from John's account in John chapter 12. Synoptics don't record that as much. Synoptics, in case you're listening, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar. Synonymous, yeah. They're like synonyms for each other.
Right.
And so that's why they're called the Synoptic Gospels. John's Gospel was written significantly later. Most Christian scholars would agree, about 30 to 40 years later than their writings. And so John has a little bit of a different take on some things, and he messes with
different
us.
in the sense that he's like almost commentating on it.
Yeah. And so John records Jesus predicting his death, and then Matthew and Mark record that Jesus made kind of like a brief temporary visit to the temple. Monday, bigger events are going to happen in the temple, but so Sunday basically comes in on the donkey. There's some conversation with him and some crowds and his disciples about his coming death, and then obviously confusion and stuff surrounding that. And then finally he does visit the temple briefly before going back. He's staying in Bethany, which is just a couple miles outside of the city at this time. So, so let's talk about the triumphal entry there. And, what are some of the thoughts that come to your mind there, Chase, things that challenge you, encourage you when you think about Jesus' entry into Jerusalem?
Well, specifically in John's account, he's talking about the stir of all the crowds. Like there's a lot of things going on in Jerusalem at this time, Passover feast. And so there's a lot of different people who are gathering in one location. And then the significance really here is the Gentile and the Galilean presence. Would you agree?
Well, it's definitely part of it, yeah. And John, there's definitely a Gentile presence, which you don't expect.
Right, and then it's, they're eager for a Messiah as well, along with the Jewish people, and then a lot of them have different perspectives on that. Some of them are like, here comes the Messiah, he's going to, overthrow the Romans, and so there's all kinds of different, opinions about who Jesus is and what he's doing, and of course Jesus is showing his, entry like a king,
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think the Gentile presence is part of the fulfillment. Isaiah prophesied that the Gentiles would stream in, and like you said, the fact that the Gentiles were looking for a Messiah is surprising, but also it's a fulfillment of Scripture.
Right.
And then interestingly, on Monday, this is to your point about how these things connect, when Jesus is quote-unquote cleansing the temple, and if you're watching, or if you're not watching, I have air quotes. I don't like the phrase cleansing the temple necessarily, but I get what it means. It's in the court of the Gentiles. So there's a connection even there. Jesus has definitely got in his mind the preparation for this kind of cosmic, global, expansion of his kingdom, and right now it's already being corrupted by this kind of prejudice and stuff against the Gentiles. So that's definitely there. As you said, Jerusalem is packed. It's during Passover, which means they're already thinking along the lines of liberation and return from exile and all of those type of things. So they are looking for a Messiah. As you said, there's definitely some different views on what the Messiah should be, could be, where he'd come from, how many Messiahs there might be. I mean, so it wasn't, it wasn't just like the Jews were like all completely unified on what necessarily to expect. Although the liberation from Rome, they were all pretty much on board with that. Although some were so much in bed with Rome, so to speak, that overthrowing of Rome would have meant a loss of power for them. So they would have been even like, well, no, we don't want that kind of Messiah. Even so, but for us to know. We live in what we would consider to be some troubled times. I hear a lot of that conversation like, oh, man, like, what about this and what about that? And, this issue on marriage or this issue on the family or this issue on taxes or immigration or like all these things that are swirling around in this kind of religious political commotion. Jerusalem would have been like that, only it was a festival of liberation. It would have been packed 5 or 6 times the amount of people. If you were to watch the videos, there's probably 40,000 people lived in Jerusalem normally, and there would have been maybe 200,000 people there. And so you've got this like packed, the phrase they use is like a powder keg. And then Jesus comes riding on a donkey, and they actually state in the book, it would be hard to overestimate the political and religious volatility incited by Jesus's actions. I mean, up until this point, Jesus had been like,
relatively quiet.
I'm the king. Shh. Don't tell anyone. You know what I mean? He actually never said he was the Messiah, and he actually never said he was the king. He actually said he was the Son of Man because he was trying to keep this very thing from happening, the powder keg explosion.
Right. And people had tried hailing him as king earlier on.
Yeah, and
he's always kind of escaping in the shadows, basically.
And now, to use John's terminology, his hour had come.
Yeah.
And so what we really need to be taking away from this first day, this Sunday, it's pretty hard to imagine a bolder way that Jesus could announce that he's the king than to come riding in on a donkey. And there's a twofold hyperlink here. One with Zechariah 9, your king comes on a donkey. And then in 1 Kings 1, David prepares Solomon for his royal reign by giving him a donkey and then having him go to the priests, the temple area, although it's not been built yet because Solomon's the one who's going to build the temple, but into the priests and the leaders and say, hail him as king. And that's where it says, long live the king, right there in 1 Kings chapter 1. And so Jesus is echoing all of those things, and people are going nuts. I mean, they're like, and then some of the Pharisees are like, shh, shh. And Jesus is like, not anymore, no more shh. And it's like, yeah, he's the king. And so for me, as a follower of Jesus, I need to be like, I need to remember, okay, Jesus is my king. And he's very much in charge of the situation here. So that's what's happening on Sunday.
And certainly adding to the volatility of it, you have all these people, like you said, there's more people than usual. The atmosphere is elevated, it's hot, and you've got all these people saying, this is our king. Meanwhile, there is a king.
Yeah, there is.
And so I think that kind of there's direct opposition. I mean, you can even feel this really in a low space, like if you're in a workplace and someone else comes in who's got the same role or job as you, and it's like this person is acknowledged as that person, and it's like, wait a second, I thought I was that person.
Yeah, wow, yeah.
And but king taking it to the highest level, and so there's there's some intentional conflict going on here.
Yeah, Jesus is, again, the authors here said that, up until this point in Jesus' ministry, he could have managed to live a long, happy, peaceful life. But his actions on this day, on Sunday, set in motion a series of events that could result in either the overthrow of Rome and the current religious establishment or his brutal death. There's no turning back at this point. And so to see the connectedness of these events is really important. Like what Jesus up until this point has been not avoiding, but delaying this thing. And now he's like, it is the time.
Right.
And interestingly, he has just raised Lazarus from the dead, which is a foreshadowing of what's going to happen with him. And then he goes into the city and announces that he is the king. And then, the second event is that he predicts his death, which is surprising. Here comes the king, the Messiah. What's he going to do? And he predicts his death, which just kind of, I think, heightens the disturbance almost, the confusion. I mean, the disciples certainly don't understand even at this point, and certainly the crowds don't understand. And so he's definitely coming as king, no bones about it, absolutely clear. But what does it mean for us, like for them and for us? What does it mean to have Jesus as our king?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not always straightforward like we would anticipate. He's riding on a donkey, not a horse.
Mm-hmm.
This king is apparently humble.
Right.
So there's this is why I love these bits of the story. It's like, has the bit about Jesus's humility really worked its way into my bones?
Right.
Do I see him as that kind of a king?
Even in John's gospel, which I mentioned earlier, it's like in chapter 12, he's saying, when he's predicting his death, he's like, the Son of Man must be lifted up.
Mm-hmm.
And so that lifted up even has that dual connotation to it. It's like lifted up as like a king, yes. Lifted up as in put to death on a cross.
As the suffering servant?
Yes.
Yes.
So it's like there's definitely something happening here. And I think even, again, with this whole story kind of freshly going in my mind, it's like, Jesus is having to trust in the Father. I remember you saying it in a sermon at some point. It was like Jesus has to trust in the Father just like we have to trust in the Father.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so Jesus, knowing that all this stuff is being put in motion, knowing that if he rides in on a donkey, it's like it's go time.
Yep.
There's no turning back. My peaceful life I'm leaving behind, basically.
Mm-hmm.
He actually has to trust in the Father in that whole process. And that's even when he talks about, again, in John 12, it's like whoever loves his life will lose it. It's like Jesus is like rehearsing the gospel to himself, putting his hope in the Father, again, through all these events to be raised.
Let me just put a little sharper point on that. So John 12 is right before he enters a city.
Mm-hmm.
And in the verse you just referenced, Jesus says, unless the grain of wheat falls in the ground and dies, it remains alone.
Yeah.
But if it goes in the ground and dies, then it will bear much fruit. And like you just said, he's kind of like, he's saying it to them, but he's also kind of saying it to himself.
Because the whole thing is his emotions.
It's seeing Jesus as a human. He's the divine human. He's the Son of God and the Son of Man. But seeing him in his humanity, the courage even to know, to get on that donkey and say, I'm going to go down. And then when confronted, not to back down, back, you guys were right. I'll tell him to be quiet. He's like, no.
I'm going to cleanse the temple.
I'm going to, that's going to be tomorrow's episode. But not only am I going to not tell him to quiet down, but I'm going to ratchet this up.
Right.
So, the last thing he does, and it's only recorded in Matthew and Mark, is he has a brief visit to the temple, which is, it's, again, to show you this, and sometimes we miss the centrality of the temple. We think, maybe wrongly so, if the church isn't super central to our lives, then we're like, oh, maybe the temple wasn't super central to their lives. No, actually, it was very central. So Jesus goes right to the temple, and there he does what he had been doing up until this point. And again, this is another one of those little episodes of the story that's just powerful and compelling. There's blind people at the temple. There's the lame, and he's receiving children to himself. Mm-hmm. And so it's just further demonstration of what kind of a king he is. I mean, even amidst all of think about everyone's praising you. Oh, so great. Who does Jesus focus on then when he gets into the temple? The blind, the lame, and the children. Yeah. And I'm just like, okay, Lord, this is the kind of king you are. Then what kind of servant should I be of this king? So.
And even riding in the triumphal entry, he's like also weeping over the city.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Wanting them to have turned. That famous line, it's like, wouldn't I have gathered you as a hen gathers her, all that stuff. And so even riding in as the king, it's like, if I was the king, it's like I wouldn't be necessarily, maybe crying. I might be lifted up or whatever, but it's just like Jesus is riding in as the suffering king, weeping over the city, wishing that it wouldn't have to be this way.
Yeah. And that's not far removed from Jesus wept, famous verse, John 11:35, at Lazarus' tomb, just a few days before. So this is definitely, we don't want to think of Jesus as a stoic.
Right.
Like, he's not emotionless. He's not a robot going through the situation. Right. The courage, the bravery that's needed, the faith that's needed in his Father's plan. Mm-hmm. He's sorrowful over the people that he loves. He's sorrowful over the people who are going to reject him. He's concerned. He's emotionally available for the people who are in need. Like, it's a very compelling story about who Jesus is and what he's about, what he is doing and what he's about.